Welcome everyone to our very first content lecture of our semester. Where today we're going to be looking at understanding the past. So before we can begin exploring civilizations, events, cultures that all shape the world, we must first ask and attempt to answer a very fundamental question, and that is, what is history? History, though it is often portrayed this way, is not merely a record of events or a list of dates. It is a method, a disciplined approach to understanding human experiences, triumphs, failures, and complexities. It helps us to better understand ourselves in our own world. But for history to fulfill this role, it must be honest. It should never serve to justify injustice or obscure darker aspects of the human condition. The historian's responsibility is to reconstruct the past as accurately as possible, despite the fact that no account can ever be complete. Some voices, especially those of the oppressed or marginalized, may be lost, but each new source, discovery, and interpretation brings us closer to a fuller picture. In that spirit, I invite you to join a journey into the human past. Here we have a 17th century projection map of the world, and this was prepared by cartographer Philip Eckebrecht for the noted German astronomer Johannes Kepler, who we might actually get to spend some time with. We'll kind of breeze through the scientific revolution. In some of my other courses that I teach, we spend a lot more time with him, but he's very significant, sort of kicks off the scientific revolution. Nonetheless, the reason that we're looking at this map is all about perspective. We often see the world map from the same perspective every time. Almost anytime you see a map, it always looks the same. This one is sort of, in a way, trying to challenge that notion or disrupt it and force you, in a way, to consider perspective, to look at the world from different points of view. And this one, particularly being an older map, showcases our limited understanding of the full breadth of the Earth at that time. So, this is meant to convey, or at least slightly convey, the scope of what our endeavor is as a class. We are going to try to cover as much of the history of the world as we possibly can. Now, of course, that means there's a lot that's going to be left out. Certain things are going to triumph over other things, but nonetheless, my goal is to give you a much more um, enlightened and nuanced understanding of the world's past so that you can better understand its present. Now we're going to run through some of the main points of our course. So first we're going to look at developing a global perspective. And I kind of hinted at this in our map slide, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth here. So the study of world history aims not only to describe what happened, but to cultivate perspective. History doesn't repeat itself in precise cycles, but it does reveal patterns in human behavior. Recognizing these patterns allows us to better understand current global issues and to act wisely in the future. To study world history is to develop cultural empathy, to sharpen our analytical skills, and to prepare ourselves for participation in a globalized society. Understanding the past enables us to better navigate complex social, political, and cultural realities today. This course encourages us to consider ourselves not just as citizens of one nation, but as global citizens, individuals responsible to a larger world community. History is foundational to global citizenship. The interconnected nature of modern life through economics, migration, communication, and climate demands historical knowledge. World War II catalyzed this awareness. In its aftermath, the United Nations created declarations of human rights, affirming the dignity of women, children, and minorities. This reflects a broader shift towards shared global principles, principles that of course are informed by history. Even if one does not identify explicitly as a global citizen, understanding global history remains vital for personal decision making, for professional competence, and for responsible civic participation. Here we have an image of Eleanor Roosevelt holding one of those declarations of human rights that took place after World War II. So again, we are highlighting this cultural shift, this global shift in a way, towards understanding our interconnectedness. And this is something that is not going to diminish or go away in any way. This is Beyond the scope of our course, we won't necessarily talk about these specific topics, but we're going to look at how this develops in older periods. History hones critical thinking, one of the most sought after skills in today's workforce. But it goes beyond that. It fosters adaptive thinking and problem solving, cross cultural competency, media literacy and analytical depth, and an open, creative mindset capable of engaging with multiple perspectives. Historians are interdisciplinary thinkers. They must interpret complex data, texts, images, artifacts, all within broader human context. This is a skill set that applies across disciplines, from law and journalism to science and public policy. And something that I always advocate for as to why I love history so much anytime somebody asks me, because everything has a history. If you study history, you have the ability to learn about any other discipline you'd like within that. I teach other courses on the history of technology, the history of science, data in society. These are things that, though I may not be a scientist myself or a technician in certain ways, I'm capable of learning about these skills and even going as far as to learn some actual practical ones as well, practicing things, not just knowing the information. But history allows that every single possible topic you could think of as big or as small has a history. And so by studying history, it gives you the ability to understand multiple disciplines. And better yet, to utilize multiple disciplines to further your understanding of history. Here we have an image that showcases some of the top skills sought for by employers in 2025. So we have analytical and critical thinking, innovative and original lines of inquiry, confidence, and competence. These are all things that you will acquire from studying history. Now, again, I'm not advocating that all of you change your major to history and need to full on, get a degree in history, but at least to study history in a history class like this, to extract from it the valuable skills such as these, and then apply those elsewhere. This is the whole point of the solving the puzzle assignments that I'm giving you. This is the point of the research paper, the primary source analysis. Um, Unfortunately, since this is an asynchronous class, I won't get to hear or see you present your work or speak in class as much, but that's also a really crucial skill that is often overlooked in other disciplines. So here we have this graphic that showcases not only those skills, but it gives those arrows that showcase how they complement one another and feed into one another constantly. So you require all three in order to study history, and the better that you get at them, they feed into those other skills. So even though you might not be studying history anytime after this, I do hope that these skills you are able to take out of this course and apply them elsewhere in your academic career and professional career. Historical knowledge is built upon two main types of evidence. So, you may have heard of these before. Hopefully, I would imagine so. We have primary sources and secondary sources. So, primary sources are direct evidence from the time, such as documents, artifacts, diaries, and photographs. And there's many more examples you can include, but it's something from the time and place that's being studied. Secondary sources are later interpretations, like biographies or scholarly articles that help provide context. So if you're going, like for your research paper, you're going to be doing some research, you're going to require both a primary source and secondary sources. The secondary sources are to help you make more sense of the time period and the place that you are studying. The primary source is going to be utilized to ground your inquiry or your argument in that time period to showcase, to use as evidence to support it. The secondary sources will help support your point that you're making as well and sort of contextualize its validity. Both of these types of sources are obviously essential, but using them effectively requires historiographical awareness. And historiography, if you're unaware of that term, is basically the study of how the study of history changes over time. It looks at how people who do study history look at things differently over time, and we'll get more into those different interpretations. So, not all primary sources are equally valuable. Critical interpretation depends on four essential questions: the author, so who created this source? Why did they create this source? The audience, for whom was this source intended? Who was expected to be reading this? Intent, what was the purpose? Information, persuasion, or even maybe justification of something. And then we need to consider the context. What was happening at that time? how would that affect their decision to write this or create whatever it was? So, whether you're analyzing a diary, a speech, or a photograph, these questions allow us to see beyond the surface. They help us understand not just what a source says, but why it was said and how it reflects its moment in history. So here we have a breakdown again of evaluating primary sources. I encourage you guys to screenshot this, save this slide. Um, Utilize this when you are doing your primary source analysis. If anything, I would say after you choose your primary source or primary sources, to utilize this sort of breakdown, write all the questions out, give your answers to them, and you should be able to draft out a great essay if you have this information. Okay, so this is here for y'all. If you need it, we kind of already ran through it, so let's move on. Okay, so here we're going to look at a case study. Now, because this is an online asynchronous, we're not really going to get to discuss this very much. So as we move through this next couple slides, I encourage you to just pause the video, read what is being shown on the screen on the slide, and then think about the questions that are asked afterwards. Rather than me just reading it to you, I mean, that would take a really long time. So I encourage you guys to do this on your own just to kind of get a sense of what I mean by evaluating primary sources. So we'll look at this brief example first. So we have the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. And again, this is not something we'll get to in our course per se, but it is, it's relevant. It's just an example. So in 1519, Hernan Cortes wrote to King Charles V, claiming that the Aztecs submitted peacefully to Spanish rule. Meanwhile, an Aztec account describes the brutal massacre at the Great Temple, depicting Spanish treachery and violence. So which source is more reliable? Both of these sources, again, are primary sources, but each reflects the bias and perspective of its author. This is the historian's task, to weigh and evaluate competing narratives through careful interpretation. And these are the skills that I'm hoping to impart to you all in this course. So here is the first source. So this is Hernan Cortez's perspective. So this is the perspective of the conquistadors of the Spanish involved in the New World. So you can pause the video here, read this. Here we have the other end of the spectrum, right? We have the Aztec account. Now this is also through I believe it's a Spanish friar who was basically listening to an Aztec give their account of it. So even within this primary source, there's still some other things you need to be careful about. But this at least gives us an honest, or at least we believe honest, perspective of what happened from their perspective, rather than just solely relying on the Spanish. And so the job of a historian is to then take these two sources among many more. But even if we were just given these two, to try to come to a consensus on what we believe really did happen, putting these two accounts together. And again, consider those questions. Who are these people talking to? Who is their intended audience? Why would they create this source? What was their intent with this? A conquistador, which if you don't know much about Cortez, I mean, he had a lot to gain from his success here and definitely would have wanted sort of the king's approval on what he was doing. He'd have a lot to gain from that. So why would he not want to sort of make a case for himself, right? Meanwhile, though the victims of this conquest, what would their perspective be? What would their intent be in telling their side or telling their story? So consider that with these two. So I kind of jumped ahead of it, but here are the actual questions I wanted you to consider with this. So to whom is each author writing? I kind of gave you a little bit of that. How do the author's different intentions affect what they wrote? What's different in their two accounts? One author was on the side of the victorious and one among the vanquished. How does the context of what side they represented affect the tone of their writing? So again, feel free to pause the video, read those two sources. If you would like, you can email me what you think of them. I'm happy to have a discussion if anyone would like. But otherwise, this is to showcase the importance of how to evaluate a primary source or different sources. Because again, just because it's a primary source doesn't mean that it is 100% factual or that you should take it at face value. You need to consider those questions, those 4 questions, in order to fully understand. And now we'll move on to material sources. So we'll use architecture as an example here. So history is not just going to be written documents, right? It's also embedded in material culture. So take the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia, however you want to pronounce it, which is located in Istanbul. Originally, it was built as a Byzantine church. It was transformed into a mosque after the Ottoman conquest, and later then into a museum, and now a mosque again. Its architecture, inscriptions, and iconography tell a complex story of conquest, faith, and cultural adaptation over centuries. Interpreting buildings, art, and everyday objects requires a deep understanding of symbolism, context, and change over time. So here we'll have some images of it. So here we have a depiction of the exterior, which if you've never actually seen the Hagia Sophia, it's a massive structure, very, very remarkable. So here we have what it sort of looked like from the outside. Here we have a depiction of some of the Greek Christians, the Byzantine, or you could even arguably Roman iconography that would have been seen inside the complex. And of course, we did mention that it ends up becoming, or the city of Constantinople will eventually get conquered by the Ottomans in 1543. But the beauty and sophistication and prowess of this building was apparent to Mehmed II. He did not just have the building destroyed. Instead, they preserved it and converted it into a mosque. And you can see they eventually added the four minarets surrounding the, the structure, which is where they play the Muslim call to prayer. Um, so they converted what was a church then into a mosque, right? And with that, we begin to see um, Arabic calligraphy inside. We see more iconography now that is representative of the Ottoman Empire and of Islam rather than Greek Orthodoxy. So again, we're able to tell the transitions that this material, this building went through, just based on what it looks like, right? We haven't even read anything yet. We haven't looked at what's really being depicted too much. We haven't spent any time on that yet. We're able to tell a lot about what's happening from it. And this is all just surface level stuff. So here we're going to run through another primary source and do the same thing that we did earlier with the Spanish conquistador narratives or the Aztec conquest narratives. So this is going to be looking at December 7th, 1942, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which is shown here in this image. We're going to focus on President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech. So again, this one is going to be in several parts, so pause the video to read this one, and then we'll move on to the next. And again, remember those four questions to consider, right? As to their intent, who wrote it, why did they write it, who did they write it for, context, things like that. Consider those four questions. Here is the second part of the speech. I know this one's a little bit longer, so apologies for that. But again, just pause the video, read through it. Here we have the very last part of the speech. Again, just finish this up, and then we'll move over to those questions. So, what message was Roosevelt conveying about the nation's people and to around the world? And this second question I like a lot more. Consider some of the word choices that he makes, right? He uses a lot of very, very specific words. And again, this is a speech. He wrote this speech for a purpose, right? Who is he talking to? What is he trying to convince them of? And what is he trying to make happen with this speech? How is he using this primary trigger, right? Primary event of causation. Consider what the secondary and tertiary ones are that he's drawing from to get what he wants, right? Which is basically to have Congress declare war on Japan, right? So consider all of those things in this. Okay, so now we're going to move on to hidden histories and historical recovery. So traditional history focuses on elites, right? For the most part, everyone's heard of kings, generals, philosophers. Even if you don't know much about these societies that they come from, there's a couple names that are basically household names, right? But what about the experiences of women, the poor, enslaved persons, and indigenous communities? So they were largely absent from the historical record, right? However, starting in the 1960s, historians began recovering these voices through social history, gender history, and post colonial studies. This shift emphasized history from below, using sources like court records, oral traditions, and domestic objects. Still, however, challenges remain. Some regions, like sub Saharan Africa or indigenous America, lack abundant written records. And again, written records are really the bread and butter of historians. Those are the sources that give the most validity, that give us the best sense of what was happening because people were choosing. Because if we can answer those four questions about those sources and compare and contrast them with others, we can get the clearest picture rather than looking purely at material or let's say material artifacts, I guess is the best thing, or art, and trying to interpret it ourselves based on, modern, um, biases in a way. So written word is always best. So others have suffered colonial erasures in their past, right? So not only do a lot of cultures in the global south or in sub-Saharan Africa not have written records, there's also the whole impact of colonial erasure. So if we go back to that Aztec Empire example, right, the Spanish end up intentionally destroying any sort of iconography, material artifacts, as well as written artifacts that remain from the Aztec perspective, right? They destroy the entire city of Tenochtitlan and then build Mexico City on top of that. Literally not only razing that to the ground, but then building their own new culture and material artifacts on top of it. Ongoing scholarship, however, works to uncover these histories and reconstruct them with care and empathy. There's much more emphasis on understanding uh, absences in the historical record or silences of certain groups today than there was in the past. And so here we have an example of this. This is Chinua Achebe. This is a photo of him when he was a little bit younger from Lagos, Nigeria. He's a renowned author, I guess is the best word to use. He's sort of foundational for African literature during this time period. And we're going to look at his perspective on this, right? So here's going to be the primary source. So this is a quote from him and I feel it was for an article. So someone was interviewing him and asked him this question. And this one I really do want you to spend some time with. The other ones I think are a little bit more easy to interpret, but this one I think gives a very or paints a really important picture, right? What we were just talking about, silences in the past. He chooses to write this story about his history, and he's shocked to see how people in a totally different society can relate to it. So obviously, as we mentioned, he's from Nigeria, and his book talks about sort of his experience there, and he ends up getting contacted by I think it's schoolgirls in college girls, sorry, I don't know, school, but college girls in South Korea, as it shows there, who expressed that they resonate a lot with this book because they too had gone through or experienced colonization as South Koreans from Japan. So even though this was shocking to him to see that stories of erasure or attempts to highlight a silenced past are unfortunately more common than initially believed, and that his work, despite it having to do with a completely different topic and geographical region, resonated with people on the other side of the world. So I spent a little bit more time on this one than the others, but I highly encourage you to read this and again try to address these questions. So history is about why things happen, otherwise known as causation. Historians analyze events through multiple levels of cause. So we have primary causes, which are direct triggers, secondary causes, which are preceding factors, and tertiary causes, which are sort of broad background to the event. Understanding historical causation requires nuance, balancing short term and long term forces, individual decisions, and systematic patterns. Okay, so now we're going to look at this a little bit more deeply. So here is a chart sort of explaining causation, basically what I just told you. What we're looking at here is why are you reading? So let's say that you have some reading to do, right, for this course. Why are you doing it? Well, the primary reason, again, that very first one, that direct trigger for why you're doing it, is because I assigned it, right? Or whatever classes maybe. The professor assigned it to you. Most likely you're going to have some of that material on the test. You need to read it, right? But if we come back a little bit and we look at some preceding factors as to why you might be reading, you can look at I want to do well in school so that I can be successful, right? This is something that you know ahead of time. You're coming into this course already with this. You know that you're going to have to do some reading to be successful in the course, therefore be successful in school. So now if we come back even further and look at sort of the broader, more general background, the tertiary cause, that is going to be that society tells me that education will help me realize my full potential. So the tertiary reason for why you would be reading something I assigned you, or that's assigned in a course, is because if you go all the way back, you're going to college for the purpose of getting an education to better your life afterwards, right? And this is something that we as a society, for the most part, all agree upon. So that's why you're here doing that. So here is an example of being assigned some reading, right? Why are you reading? Here's a primary cause, secondary cause, and a tertiary cause. So now let's look at an actual event. So here we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So we're looking at why did the US enter World War II? So the primary reason, right, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, right? That's the direct trigger. But if we come back a little bit, look at some of the preceding factors that were already there before that event happened, President Roosevelt had already been actively working to help Britain fend off potential German invasion, right? If you study this period and we look a little bit further back, look at the context of this time, there were already things in motion that were kind of leaning the U.S. towards war. If anything, you could say that the bombing of Pearl Harbor is really just that spark in a sense. Then, if we go even further back and look at the much broader background of sort of geopolitics in the Pacific at the time, Japan and the US were in competition for control of the Pacific. The US had a lot of territories over there. Japan was carving out its own empire during this period. And so there was already tension between the two. Plus, war had already begun in Europe and over in different parts of the world. So it was sort of already a huge possibility, right? So looking at the context, that's likely why. So here we have two examples of that. Let's look at one more. So now we're looking at the conquest of Constantinople, right? So um, we looked at the Hagia Sophia earlier, mentioned briefly that it was conquered by Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottomans, in 1453. So let's look at that example, right? Mehmed II wanted to make a statement and achieve what no other sultan had been able to achieve. Now, we're not going to study this period too much, but basically, the Ottomans had been trying to conquer the city for a very long time. It was the very last holdout of ancient Rome, or what was the Byzantine Empire at this time. They've been dying to capture for quite some time, basically to show the triumph of Islam over Christianity in that region during this time. So he really wanted to do that. That was his own personal reason, arguably the direct trigger. Coming back a little bit further now, secondary cause, Constantinople was a great prize. Not just any city, it lay at the heart of the East-West trade. His conquest would send a clear message, basically to all of the world, right, of the prominence of this new Ottoman Empire. Then, if we look even further back at the broader context, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding since its founding. Conquest served to bring in new wealth and new people into the empire. So realistically, it was just a matter of time, right? The Ottomans had already been expanding. They had gone further east, they had gone further west. They already controlled most of Southeast Europe. They controlled most of the Greek mainland already at this point. It was literally just this one city left. And again, if we look at that secondary reason, that there was a lot of prominence to holding this city and a lot of wealth that would come from it, obviously the context showcases that or the context of the tertiary reason triggers that secondary reason, right? So there's another example. All right, now we turn our attention to some of our final points. I think we have two more major slides: interpretation and revisionism. So historical interpretation changes over time. I kind of already mentioned that term, historiography. The study of history over time does change, right? It's a reflection of your own social context. So early historians emphasized great men, right? I think everyone might be familiar with the term great man history. So great men and heroic deeds, right? Those are the things where people, you have the household names. Everyone has heard of Napoleon. Most people have heard of Socrates, right? Most people know ancient Egypt was a place. But they're not really going that into depth, right? Me, as someone who loves the classics, right? I love ancient Greece and Rome, or really the ancient Mediterranean as a whole. I studied a lot of that in undergrad, and I continue to read up on it, even though it's not really my main focus anymore. But the fact that we hail ancient Greece and Rome as being the classics, classic to who? Classic to who? Why? Right? I mean, we put them in this bubble when in reality, if you study their history more in depth, they did not exist in a bubble. They were not solely responsible for all of their innovations and developments. They were constantly interacting with other groups and peoples across the Mediterranean that are excluded from that, right? We think of having ancient Greece and then Rome goes copy paste and then makes it better, but that's really not true, right? Anyway, I kind of went on a tangent there, but let's look at some different interpretations, right? So people focus mainly on great men, things like that. Now, later, scholars have now emphasized everyday life, economic structures, ideologies, and social movements, right? These are things that are much more popular today if you go and look for history books. Now, I would also argue that a lot of this is academic, if you're looking for articles or if you're looking at um, scholarly work. You see a lot of this. I think if you still go to Barnes and Nobles, the popular history section might not have as much of this. I think public history is also getting a lot better, though, where we begin to see more of an emphasis on these as well. But unfortunately, for people who are not studying history or don't, study it all the time or whatever, they tend to purchase more of the great men history because that's the stuff that people know about, that people want to learn about, right? But I think there is a growing trend that is shifting even in public history more into this path as well. So I think that's a good thing. So each school, Marxism, feminism, postcolonialism, intellectual history, all offer a new lens for interpretation. Now, this new process of interpretation is called revisionism. So if you hear revisionist history, that's what this means. And it's not about distorting the past in any way. Let me absolutely nail that down. But it's aiming to clarify the past by including voices and perspectives that were previously overlooked, looking at new evidence, basically. Not that new stuff is being uncovered, but looking at things that were previously overlooked, right? Looking at sources that people didn't really give much attention to before, looking at material culture, looking at perspectives of ordinary people. One thing I always tell people is if you want to be remembered long, hundreds of years, thousands of years, whatever, keep a diary, right? I mean, if you write about your life every single day, that tells so much about how people think, feel, and act every single day. What they think about the world, what they did that day, what they ate, what they were, whatever it is you choose to write. It gives your perspective, and those are the things that we use today to understand the past more in detail. So, if you want to be remembered historically, write a diary and bury it somewhere, I guess. Uh, all right, let's move on to our final point. Oh, actually, sorry, I was wrong. This is just another infographic that's just showing you those different interpretations or some of the more popular ones. So we have the progressive interpretation, which is that history moves in one direction toward more democratic values in society. Scholarship highlighted political changes. I would actually argue against that. I don't think progress is inevitable, and I don't think it is equal either. So, but that's their interpretation. Intellectual history, right? That history is moved by ideas which drive people to make particular choices. Scholarship investigated the history of human thought are considered philosophical questions. And then we have social history. History is moved by all people and not just elites. Scholarship looked at issues affecting all classes and often included consideration of gender. So these two are much more popular today. Okay, so here we have another two sources or two perspectives on different types of history. So we'll have one that is promoting this great man history and one that is taking the opposite approach. So we have Thomas Carlyle, very famous, I think 18th, could be 18th century Scottish historian, maybe 17th century. So he's obviously promoting the great men, right? He's promoting that idea of history. Contrary to him, we have Leo Tolstoy, the very famous author. This is a quote from War and Peace that is arguing against that. So again, pause the video on these two lectures or these 2 points, and we'll come and address these questions over here. So, which kind of history do you prefer? The great mankind or the one we might call the everyone kind? And why? I mean, there's not a wrong answer here per se, but I'm just curious why you prefer one over the other. Also, consider whose argument is more convincing, Carlyle's or Tolstoy's, and why do you think that is? Okay, now our final point. I'm sorry, I kept thinking we're at the end of it and we were not. So here we are, last point, historical empathy and final thoughts. So one of the most important skills that we develop is going to be historical empathy. That is the ability to encounter the past on its own terms without imposing our modern values or judgments. To understand the past clearly, we must acknowledge our own biases, remain open to complexity, and value multiple perspectives. In doing so, we develop not only stronger historical thinking, but also a deeper sense of humility, curiosity, and connection to the human experience. Here are some key terms from this chapter for you guys to study. You might see them on your quizzes and on your exams. I'll put these at the end of every lecture that we go through, but otherwise, thank you guys. I know this one was a little bit longer. I went on a few tangents, so that's my fault. Most of the lectures I'm going to try to keep between around the 20-minute mark. Hopefully that works out. but I tend to go off a little bit. So let me know if you had any problems hearing this, accessing this. If you have any questions or concerns, need to meet to discuss anything, please just send me an email. Happy to help out. Take care.